The Poverty of Philosophy by Karl Marx. Chapter 2. The Metaphysics of Political Economy. Part 1. The Method. Here we are, right in Germany. We shall now have to talk metaphysics while talking political economy. And in this again we shall but follow Monsieur Proudhon's, quote, contradictions. Just now he forced us to speak English, to become pretty well English ourselves. Now the scene is changing. Monsieur Proudhon is transporting us to our dear fatherland and is forcing us, whether we like it or not, to become German again. If the Englishman transforms men into hats, the German transforms hats into ideas. The Englishman is Ricardo, rich banker and distinguished economist. The German is Hegel, simple professor at the University of Berlin. Louis XV, the last absolute monarch and representative of the decadence of French royalty, had attached to his person a physician who was himself France's first economist. This doctor, this economist, represented the imminent and certain triumph of the French bourgeoisie. Dr. Quesnay made his science out of political economy. He summarized it in his famous Tableau économique. Besides the 1,001 commentaries on this table which have appeared, we possess one by the doctor himself. It is the, quote, analysis of the economic table, followed by, quote, 7 important observations. Monsieur Proudhon is another Dr. Quesnay. He is the Quesnay of the metaphysics of political economy. Now metaphysics, indeed all philosophy, can be summed up, according to Hegel, in method. We must therefore try to elucidate the method of Monsieur Proudhon, which is at least as foggy as the economic table. It is for this reason that we are making 7 more or less important observations. If Dr. Proudhon is not pleased with our observations, well then, he will have to become an Abbé Baideau and give the, quote, explanation of the economico-metaphysical method himself. First observation, quote, we are not giving a history according to the order in time, but according to the sequence of ideas. Economic phases or categories are in their manifestation sometimes contemporary, sometimes inverted. Economic theories have nonetheless their logical sequence and their serial relation in the understanding. It is this order that we flatter ourselves we have discovered. Parenthesis, Proudhon, Volume 1, page 146. Monsieur Proudhon most certainly wanted to frighten the French by flinging quasi-Hegelian phrases at them. So we have to deal with 2 men, firstly with Monsieur Proudhon and then with Hegel. How does Monsieur Proudhon distinguish himself from other economists? And what part does Hegel play in Monsieur Proudhon's political economy? Economists express the relations of bourgeois production, the division of labor, credit, money, etc., as fixed, immutable, eternal categories. Monsieur Proudhon, who has these ready-made categories before him, wants to explain to us the act of formation, the genesis of these categories, principles, laws, ideas, thoughts. Economists explain how production takes place in the above-mentioned relations, but what they do not explain is how these relations themselves are produced, that is, the historical movement which gave them birth. Monsieur Proudhon, taking these relations for principles, categories, abstract thoughts, has merely to put into order these thoughts, which are to be found alphabetically arranged at the end of every treatise on political economy. The economist's material is the active, energetic life of man. Monsieur Proudhon's material is the dogmas of the economists. But the moment we cease to pursue the historical movement of production relations, of which the categories are but theoretical expression, the moment we want to see in these categories no more than ideas, spontaneous thoughts, independent of real relations, we are forced to attribute the origin of these thoughts to the movement of pure reason. How does pure, eternal, impersonal reason give rise to these thoughts? How does it proceed in order to produce them? If we had Monsieur Proudhon's intrepidity in the matter of Hegelianism, we should say, it is distinguished in itself from itself. What does this mean? Impersonal reason, having outside itself neither a base on which it can pose itself, nor an object to which it can oppose itself, nor a subject with which it can compose itself, is forced to turn head over heels, imposing itself, opposing itself, and composing itself. Position, opposition, composition. Or to speak Greek, we have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. For those who do not know the Hegelian language, we shall give the ritual formula: affirmation, negation, and negation of the negation. That is what language means. It is certainly not Hebrew, with due apologies to Monsieur Proudhon, but it is the language of this pure reason, separate from the individual. Instead of the ordinary individual with his ordinary manner of speaking and thinking, we have nothing but this ordinary manner purely and simply, without the individual. It is surprising that everything, in the final abstraction, for we have here an abstraction and not an analysis, presents itself as a logical category? Is it surprising that, if you let drop little by little all that constitutes the individuality of a house, leaving out first of all the materials of which it is composed, then the form that distinguishes it, you end up with nothing but a body, that, if you leave out on account the limits of this body, you soon have nothing but a space, that if, finally, you leave out of the account the dimensions of this space, there is absolutely nothing left but pure quantity, the logical category? If we abstract thus from every subject all the alleged incidents, animate or inanimate, men or things, we are right in saying that in the final abstraction, the only substance left is the logical category. Thus the metaphysicians who in making these abstractions think they are making analyses, and who, the more they detach themselves from things, imagine themselves to be getting all the nearer to the point of penetrating to their core. These metaphysicians in turn are right in saying that things here below are embroideries of which the logical categories constitute the canvas. This is what distinguishes the philosopher from the Christian. The Christian, in spite of logic, has only one incarnation of the Logos. The philosopher has never finished with incarnations. If all that exists, all that lives on land and underwater, can be reduced by abstraction to a logical category, if the whole real world can be drowned thus in a world of abstractions, in the world of logical categories, who need be astonished at it? All that exists, all that lives on land and underwater, exists and lives only by some kind of movement. Thus, the movement of history produces social relations. Industrial movement gives us industrial products, etc. Just as by means of abstraction we have transformed everything into a logical category, so one only has to make an abstraction of every characteristic distinctive of different movements to attain movement in its abstract condition. Purely formal movement, the purely logical formula of movement. If one finds in logical categories the substance of all things, one imagines one has found in the logical formula of movement the absolute method, which not only explains all things, but also implies the movement of things. It is of this absolute method that Hegel speaks of in these terms. Quote, "Method is the absolute, unique, supreme, infinite force which no object can resist. It is the tendency of reason to find itself again, to recognize itself in every object." Logic, Volume 3, page 29. All things being reduced to a logical category, and every movement, every act of production, to method, it follows naturally that every aggregate of products in production, of objects and of movement, can be reduced to a form of applied metaphysics. What Hegel has done for religion, law, etc., Monsieur Proudhon seeks to do for political economy. So what is this absolute method? The abstraction of movement. What is the abstraction of movement? Movement in abstract condition. What is movement in abstract condition? The purely logical formula of movement or the movement of pure reason. Wherein does the movement of pure reason consist? In posing itself, opposing itself, composing itself, in formulating itself as thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or yet in affirming itself, negating itself, and negating its negation. How does reason manage to affirm itself, to pose itself in a definite category? That is the business of reason itself and of its apologists. But once it has managed to pose itself as a thesis, this thought, opposed to itself, splits up into two contradictory thoughts, the positive and the negative, the yes and no. The struggle between these two antagonistic elements comprised in the antithesis constitutes the dialectical movement. The yes becoming no, the no becoming yes, the yes becoming both yes and no, the no becoming both no and yes. The contraries balance, neutralize, paralyze each other. The fusion of these two contradictory thoughts constitutes a new thought, which is the synthesis of them. This thought splits up again into two contradictory thoughts, which in turn fuse into a new synthesis. Of this travail is born a group of thoughts. This group of thoughts follows the same dialectic movement as the simple category, and has a contradictory group as antithesis. Of these two groups of thoughts is born a new group of thoughts, which is the antithesis of them. Just as from the dialectic movement of the simple categories is born the group, so from the dialectic movement of the groups is born the series, and from the dialectic movement of the series is born the entire system. Apply this method to the categories of political economy, and you have the logic and metaphysics of political economy. Or in other words, you have the economic categories that everybody knows, translated into a little-known language which makes them look as if they had never blossomed forth in an intellect of pure reason. So much do these categories seem to engender one another, to be linked up and intertwined with one another by the very working of the dialectic movement. The reader must not get alarmed at these metaphysics with all their scaffolding of categories, groups, series, and systems. Monsieur Proudhon, in spite of all the trouble he has taken to scale the heights of the system of contradictions, has never been able to raise himself above the first two rungs of simple thesis and antithesis, and even these he has mounted only twice, and on one of these two occasions he fell over backwards. Up to now, we have expounded only the dialectics of Hegel. We shall see later how Monsieur Proudhon has succeeded in reducing it to the meanest proportions. Thus, for Hegel, all that has happened and is still happening is only just what is happening in his own mind. Thus the philosophy of history is nothing but the history of philosophy, of his own philosophy. There is no longer a, quote, history according to the order in time. There is only, quote, the sequence of ideas in the understanding. He thinks he is constructing the world by the movement of thought, whereas he is merely reconstructing systematically and classifying by the absolute method of thoughts which are in the minds of all. Second observation. Economic categories are only the theoretical expressions, the abstractions of the social relations of production. Monsieur Proudhon, holding this upside down like a true philosopher, sees in actual relations nothing but the incarnation of the principles of these categories which were slumbering, so Monsieur Proudhon the philosopher tells us, in the bosom of the, quote, impersonal reason of humanity. Monsieur Proudhon the economist understands very well that men make cloth, linen, or silk materials in definite relations of production. But what he has not understood is that these definite social relations are just as much produced by men as linen, flax, etc. Social relations are closely bound up with productive forces. In acquiring new productive forces, men change their mode of production, and in changing their mode of production and changing the way of earning their living, they change all their social relations. The hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord. The steam mill, society with the industrial capitalist. The same men who establish their social relations in conformity with the material productivity produce also principles, ideas, and categories in conformity with their social relations. Thus the ideas, these categories, are as little eternal as the relations they express. They are historical and transitory products. There is a continual movement of growth in productive forces, of destruction in social relations, of formation in ideas. The only immutable thing is the abstraction of movement, mors immortalis. Third observation. The production relations of every society form a whole. Monsieur Proudhon considers economic relations as so many social phases, engendering one another, resulting one from the other like the antithesis from the thesis, and realizing in their logical sequence the impersonal reason of humanity. The only drawback to this method is that when he comes to examine a single one of these phases, Monsieur Proudhon cannot explain it without having recourse to all the other relations of society, which relations, however, he has not yet made his dialectic movement engender. When after that, Monsieur Proudhon, by means of pure reason, proceeds to give birth to these other phases, he treats them as if they were newborn babes. He forgets that they are of the same age as the first. Thus, to arrive at the constitution of value, which for him is the basis of all economic evolutions, he could not do so without division of labor, competition, etc. Yet in the series, in the understanding of Monsieur Proudhon, in the logical sequence, these relations did not yet exist. In constructing the edifice of an ideological system by means of the categories of political economy, the limbs of the social system are dislocated. The different limbs of society are converted into so many separate societies, following one upon the other. How, indeed, could the single logical formula of movement, of sequence, of time explain the structure of society in which all relations coexist simultaneously and support one another? Fourth observation. Let us see now to what modifications Monsieur Proudhon subjects Hegel's dialectics when he applies it to political economy. For him, Monsieur Proudhon, every economic category has two sides, one good, the other bad. He looks upon these categories as the petty bourgeois looks upon the great men of history. Napoleon was a great man. He did a lot of good, but he also did a lot of harm. The good side and the bad side, the advantages and drawbacks, taken together form for Monsieur Proudhon the contradiction in every economic category. The problem to be solved? To keep the good side while eliminating the bad. Slavery is an economic category like any other. Thus, it also has its two sides. Let us leave alone the bad side and talk about the good side of slavery. Needless to say, we are dealing only with direct slavery, with Negro slavery in Suriname, in Brazil, and the southern states of North America. Direct slavery is just as much the pivot of bourgeois industry as machinery, credits, etc. Without slavery, you have no cotton. Without cotton, you have no modern industry. It is slavery that gave the colonies their value. It is the colonies that created world trade, and it is world trade that is the precondition of large-scale industry. Thus, slavery is an economic category of the greatest importance. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive of all countries, would be transformed into a patriarchal country. Wipe North America off the map of the world, and you will have anarchy, the complete decay of modern commerce and civilization. Cause slavery to disappear, and you will have wiped America off the map of nations. Thus, slavery, because it is an economic category, has always existed among the institutions of the peoples. Modern nations have been able only to disguise slavery in their own countries, but they have imposed it without disguise upon the New World. What would Monsieur Proudhon do to save slavery? He would formulate the problem thus: preserve the good side of this economic category, eliminate the bad. Hegel has no problems to formulate. He has only dialectics. Monsieur Proudhon has nothing of Hegel's dialectics but the language. For him, the dialectic movement is the dogmatic distinction between good and bad. Let us for a moment consider Monsieur Proudhon himself as a category. Let us examine his good and bad side, his advantages and his drawbacks. If he has the advantage over Hegel of setting problems which he reserves the right of solving for the greater good of humanity, he has the drawback of being stricken with sterility when it is a question of engendering a new category by dialectical birth throes. What constitutes dialectical movement is the coexistence of two contradictory sides, their conflict and their fusion into a new category. The very setting of the problem of eliminating the bad side cuts short the dialectic movement. It is not the category which is posed and opposed to itself by its contradictory nature. It is Monsieur Proudhon who gets excited, perplexed, and frets and fumes between the two sides of the category. Caught thus in a blind alley, from which it is difficult to escape by legal means, Monsieur Proudhon takes a real flying leap, which transports him at one bound into a new category. Then it is that, to his astonished gaze, is revealed the serial relation in the understanding. He takes the first category that comes handy, and attributes to it arbitrarily the quality of supplying a remedy for the drawbacks of the category to be purified. Thus, if we are to believe Monsieur Proudhon, taxes remedy the drawbacks of monopoly, the balance of trade, the drawbacks of taxes, landed property, the drawbacks of credit. By taking the economic categories thus successively, one by one, and making one the antidote to the other, Monsieur Proudhon manages to make with this mixture of contradictions and antidotes to contradictions 2 volumes of contradictions, which he rightly entitles The System of Economic Contradictions. Fifth observation. Quote, in the absolute reason, all these ideas are equally simple and general. In fact, we attain knowledge only by a sort of scaffolding of our ideas. But truth in itself is independent of these dialectical symbols and freed from the combinations of our minds. Parenthesis, Proudhon, Volume 2, page 97. Here, all of a sudden, by a kind of switchover of which we now know the secret, the metaphysics of political economy has become an illusion. Never has Monsieur Proudhon spoken more truly. Indeed, from the moment the process of the dialectic movement is reduced to the simple process of opposing good to bad, and of administering one category as an antidote to another, the categories are deprived of all spontaneity. The idea, quote, ceases to function. There is no life left in it. It is no longer posed or decomposed into categories. The sequence of categories has become a sort of scaffolding. Dialectics has ceased to be the movement of absolute reason. There is no longer any dialectics but only, at the most, absolutely pure morality. When Monsieur Proudhon spoke of the serial relation and understanding, of the logical sequence of categories, he declared positively that he did not want to give history according to the order in time, that is, in Monsieur Proudhon's view, the historical sequence in which the categories have manifested themselves. Thus for him everything happened in the pure ether of reason. Everything was to be derived from this ether by means of dialectics. Now that he has to put this dialectics into practice, his reason is in default. Monsieur Proudhon's dialectics run counter to Hegel's dialectics, and now we have Monsieur Proudhon reduced to saying that the order in which he gives the economic categories is no longer the order in which they engender one another. Economic evolutions are no longer the evolutions of reason itself. What, then, does Monsieur Proudhon give us? Real history, which is, according to Monsieur Proudhon's understanding, the sequence in which the categories have manifested themselves in order of time? No. History as it takes place in the idea itself? Still less. That is, neither the profane history of categories nor their sacred history. What history does he give us then? The history of his own contradictions. Let us see how they go, and how they drag Monsieur Proudhon in their train. Before entering upon this examination, which gives rise to the sixth important observation, we have yet another, less important observation to make. Let us admit with Monsieur Proudhon that real history, history according to the order in time, is the historical sequence in which ideas, categories, and principles have manifested themselves. Each principle has had its own century in which to manifest itself. The principle of authority, for example, had the 11th century, just as the principle of individualism had the 18th century. In logical sequence, it was the century that belonged to the principle, and not the principle which belonged to the century. When consequently, in order to save principles as much as to save history, we ask ourselves why a particular principle was manifested in the 11th century or in the 18th century, rather than in any other, we are necessarily forced to examine minutely what men were like in the 11th century, what they were like in the 18th, what were their respective needs, their productive forces, their mode of production, the raw materials of their production. In short, what were the relations between man and man which resulted from all these conditions of existence? To get to the bottom of all these questions, what is this but to draw up the real profane history of men in every century, and to present these men as both the authors and the actors of their own drama? But the moment you present men as the actors and authors of their own history, you arrive, by detour, at the real starting point, because you have abandoned those eternal principles of which you spoke at the outset. Monsieur Proudhon has not even gone far enough along the crossroad which an ideologist takes to reach the main road of history. Sixth observation. Let us take the crossroad with Monsieur Proudhon. We shall concede that economic relations, viewed as immutable laws, eternal principles, ideal categories, existed before active and energetic men did. We shall concede further that these laws, principles, and categories had, since the beginning of time, slumbered, quote, in the impersonal reason of humanity. We have already seen that, with all these changeless and motionless eternities, there is no history left. There is at most history in the idea, that is, history reflected in the dialectic movement of pure reason. Monsieur Proudhon, by saying that, in the dialectic movement ideas are no longer, quote, differentiated, has done away with both the shadow of movement and the movement of shadows, by means of which one could have still created at least a semblance of history. Instead of this, he imputes to history his own impotence. He lays the blame on everything, even the French language. Quote, Is it not correct, then, says Monsieur Proudhon the philosopher, to say that something appears, that something is produced? In civilization as in the universe, everything has existed, has acted from eternity. This applies to the whole of social economy. Parenthesis, Volume 2, page 102. So great is the productive force of the contradictions which function, and which made Monsieur Proudhon function, that, in trying to explain history, he is forced to deny it. In trying to explain the successive appearance of social relations, he denies that anything can appear. In trying to explain production, with all its phases, he questions whether anything can be produced. Thus, for Monsieur Proudhon, there is no longer any history, no longer any sequence of ideas. And yet his book still exists, and it is precisely that book which is, to use his own expression, quote, history according to the sequence of ideas. How shall we find a formula, for Monsieur Proudhon is a man of formulas, to help him clear all these contradictions in one leap? To this end he has invented a new reason, which is neither the pure and virgin absolute reason, nor the common reason of men living and acting in different periods, but a reason quite apart, the reason of the person, society, of the subject, humanity, which under the pen of Monsieur Proudhon figures at times also as, quote, social genius, quote, general reason, or finally as, quote, human reason. This reason, decked out under so many names, betrays itself nevertheless, at every moment, as the individual reason of Monsieur Proudhon, with its good and its bad side, its antidotes and its problems. Quote, human reason does not create truth, hidden in the depths of absolute eternal reason. It can only unveil it, but such truths as it has unveiled up to now are incomplete, insufficient, and consequently contradictory. Hence, economic categories, being themselves truths discovered, revealed by human reason, by social genius, are equally incomplete, and contain within themselves the germ of contradictions. Before Monsieur Proudhon, social genius saw only the antagonistic elements, and not the synthetic formula, both hidden simultaneously in absolute reason. Economic relations, which merely realize on earth these insufficient truths, these incomplete ideas, are consequently contradictory in themselves and present two sides, one good, the other bad. To find complete truth, the idea, in all its fullness, the synthetic formula that is to annihilate the contradiction, this is the problem of social genius. This again is why, in Monsieur Proudhon's illusion, the same social genius has been harried from one category to another without ever having been able, despite all its battery of categories, to snatch from God or from absolute reason a synthetic formula. Quote, at first, society, parenthesis, social genius, states a primary fact, puts forward a hypothesis, a veritable antinomy, whose antagonistic results develop in the social economy in the same way as its consequences could have been deduced in the mind. So that industrial movement, following in all things the deduction of ideas, splits up into two currents, one of useful effects, the other of subversive results. To bring harmony into the constitution of this two-side principle, and to solve this antinomy, society gives rise to a second, which will soon be followed by a third. And progress of social genius will take place in this manner until, having exhausted all its contradictions, I suppose, but it is not proved that there is a limit to human contradictions, it returns in one leap to all its former positions and with a single formula solves all its problems. Parenthesis, Volume 1, page 133. Just as the antithesis was before turned into an antidote, so now the thesis becomes a hypothesis. This change of terms, coming from Monsieur Proudhon, has no longer anything surprising for us. Human reason, which is anything but pure, having only incomplete vision, encounters at every step new problems to be solved. Every new thesis which it discovers in absolute reason, and which is the negation of the first thesis, becomes for it a synthesis, which it accepts rather naively as the solution of the problem in question. It is thus that this reason frets and fumes in ever-renewing contradictions until, coming to the end of the contradictions, it perceives that all its theses and syntheses are merely contradictory hypotheses. In its perplexity, quote, human reason, social genius, returns in one leap to all its former positions and in a single formula solves all its problems. This unique formula, by the way, constitutes Monsieur Proudhon's true discovery. It is constituted value. Hypotheses are made only in view of a certain aim. The aim that social genius, speaking through the mouth of Monsieur Proudhon, set itself in the first place was to eliminate the bad in every economic category in order to have nothing left but the good. For it, the good, the supreme well-being, the real practical aim is equality. And why did the social genius aim at equality rather than inequality, fraternity, Catholicism, or any other principle? Because, quote, humanity has successively realized so many separate hypotheses only in view of a superior hypothesis, which precisely is equality. In other words, because equality is Monsieur Proudhon's ideal. He imagines that the division of labor, credit, the workshop, all economic relations were invented merely for the benefit of equality, and yet they always ended up by turning against it. Since history and the fiction of Monsieur Proudhon contradict each other at every step, the latter concludes that there is a contradiction. If there is a contradiction, it exists only between his fixed idea and real movement. Henceforth, the good side of an economic relation is that which affirms equality. The bad side, that which negates it and affirms inequality. Every new category is a hypothesis of the social genius to eliminate the inequality engendered by the preceding hypothesis. In short, equality is the primordial intention, the mystical tendency, the providential aim that the social genius has constantly before its eyes as it whirls in the circle of economic contradictions. Thus, providence is the locomotive which makes the whole of Monsieur Proudhon's economic baggage move better than his pure and volatilized reason. He has devoted to providence a whole chapter which follows the one on taxes. Providence, providential aim, this is the great word used today to explain the movement of history. In fact, this word explains nothing. It is at most a rhetorical form, one of various ways of paraphrasing facts. It is a fact that in Scotland, landed property acquired a new value by the development of English industry. This industry opened up new outlets for wool. In order to produce wool on a large scale, arable land had to be transformed into pasturage. To effect this transformation, the estates had to be concentrated. To concentrate the estates, small holdings had first to be abolished. Thousands of tenants had to be driven from their native soil, and a few shepherds in charge of millions of sheep to be installed in their place. Thus, by successive transformations, landed property in Scotland has resulted in the driving out of men by sheep. Now, to say that the providential aim of the institution of landed property in Scotland was to have men driven out by sheep, and you will have made providential history. Of course, the tendency towards equality belongs to our century. To say now that all former centuries, with entirely different needs, means of production, etc., worked providentially for the realization of equality is firstly to substitute the means and the men of our century for the men's and the means of earlier centuries, and to misunderstand the historical movement by which the successive generations transformed the results acquired by the generations that preceded them. Economists know very well that the very thing that was for the one a finished product was for the other but the raw material for new production. Suppose, as M. Proudhon does, that social genius produced, or rather improvised, the feudal lords with the providential aim of transforming the settlers into responsible and equally placed workers, and you will have effected a substitution of aims and of persons worthy of the providence that instituted landed property in Scotland in order to give itself the malicious pleasure of driving out men by sheep. But since M. Proudhon takes such a tender interest in providence, we refer him to the Histoire de l'économie politique of M. de Villeneuve-Bergamont, who likewise goes in pursuit of a providential aim. This aim, however, is not equality, but Catholicism. Seventh and last observation. Economists have a singular method of procedure. There are only two kinds of institutions for them, artificial and natural. The institutions of feudalism are artificial institutions. Those of the bourgeoisie are natural institutions. In this, they resemble the theologians, who likewise establish two kinds of religion. Every religion which is not theirs is an invention of men, while their own is an emanation from God. When the economists say that present-day relations, the relations of bourgeois production, are natural, they imply that these are the relations in which wealth is created and productive forces developed in conformity with the laws of nature. These relations therefore are themselves natural laws independent of the influence of time. They are eternal laws which must always govern society. Thus, there has been history, but there is no longer any. There has been history, since there were the institutions of feudalism, and in these institutions of feudalism we find quite different relations of production from those of bourgeois society, which the economists tried to pass off as natural and, as such, eternal. Feudalism also had its proletariat, serfdom, which contained all the germs of the bourgeoisie. Feudal production also had two antagonistic elements which are likewise designated by the name of the good side and the bad side of feudalism, irrespective of the fact that it is always the bad side that in the end triumphs over the good side. It is the bad side that produces the movement which makes history by providing a struggle. If, during the epoch of the domination of feudalism, the economists, enthusiastic over the knightly virtues, the beautiful harmony between rights and duties, the patriarchal life of the towns, the prosperous condition of domestic industry in the countryside, the development of industry organized into corporations, guilds, and fraternities, in short, everything that constitutes the good side of feudalism, had set themselves the problem of eliminating everything that cast a shadow on the picture, serfdom, privileges, anarchy. What would have happened? All the enemies which called forth the struggle would have been destroyed, and the development of the bourgeoisie nipped in the bud. One would have set oneself the absurd problem of eliminating history. After the triumph of the bourgeoisie, there was no longer any question of the good or the bad side of feudalism. The bourgeoisie took possession of the productive forces it had developed under feudalism. All the old economic forms, the corresponding civil relations, the political state which was the official expression of the old civil society, were smashed. Thus, feudal production, to be judged properly, must be considered as a form of production founded on antagonism. It must be shown how wealth was produced within this antagonism, how the productive forces were developed at the same time as class antagonisms, how one of the classes, the bad side, the drawback of society, went on growing until the material conditions for its emancipation had attained full maturity. Is this not as good as saying that the mode of production, the relations in which productive forces are developed, are anything but eternal laws, but that they correspond to a definite development of men and of their productive forces, and that a change in men's productive forces necessarily brings about a change in their relations of production? As the main thing is not to be deprived of the fruits of civilization, of the acquired productive forces, the traditional forms in which they produced must be smashed. From this moment, the revolutionary class becomes conservative. The bourgeoisie begins with a proletariat which is itself a relic of the proletariat of feudal times. In the course of its historical development, the bourgeoisie necessarily develops its antagonistic character, which at first is more or less disguised, existing only in a latent state. As the bourgeoisie develops, there develops in its bosom a new proletariat, a modern proletariat. There develops a struggle between the proletarian class and the bourgeois class, a struggle which, before being felt, perceived, appreciated, understood, avowed, and proclaimed aloud by both sides, expresses itself, to start with, merely in partial and momentary conflicts, in subversive acts. On the other hand, if all the members of the modern bourgeoisie have the same interests, inasmuch as they form a class as against another class, they have opposite, antagonistic interests inasmuch as they stand face to face with one another. This opposition of interests results from the economic conditions of the bourgeois life. From day to day, it thus becomes clearer that the production relations in which the bourgeoisie moves have not a simple, uniform character, but a dual character, that in the self-same relations in which wealth is produced, poverty is also produced, that in the self-same relations in which there is a development of the productive forces, there is also a force-producing repression, that these relations produce bourgeois wealth, i.e., the wealth of the bourgeois class, only by continually annihilating the wealth of the individual members of this class and by producing an ever-growing proletariat. The more the antagonistic character comes to light, the more the economists, the scientific representatives of bourgeois production, find themselves in conflict with their own theory, and different schools arise. We have the fatalist economists, who in their theory are as indifferent to what they call the drawbacks of bourgeois production as the bourgeois themselves are in practice to the sufferings of the proletarians who help them to acquire wealth. In this fatalist school, there are classics and romantics. The classics, like Adam Smith and Ricardo, represent a bourgeoisie which, while still struggling with the relics of feudal society, works only to purge economic relations of feudal taints, to increase the productive forces, and to give a new upsurge to industry and commerce. The proletariat that takes part in this struggle and is absorbed in this feverish labor experiences only passing, accidental sufferings, and itself regards them as such. Economists like Adam Smith and Ricardo, who are the historians of this epoch, have no other mission than that of showing how wealth is acquired in bourgeois production relations, of formulating these relations into categories, into laws, and of showing how superior these laws, these categories, are for the production of wealth to the laws and categories of feudal society. Poverty is in their eyes merely a pang which accompanies every childbirth, in nature as in industry. The Romantics belong to our own age, in which the bourgeoisie is in direct opposition to the proletariat, in which poverty is engendered in as great abundance as wealth. The economists now pose as blasé fatalists, who from their elevated position cast a profoundly disdainful glance at the human machines who manufacture wealth. They copy all the developments given by their predecessors, and the indifference which in the latter was merely naivete becomes in them coquetry. Next comes the humanitarian school, which sympathizes with the bad side of present-day production relations. It seeks, by way of easing its conscience, to palliate, even if slightly, the real contrasts. It sincerely deplores the distress of the proletariat, the unbridled competition of the bourgeois among themselves. It counsels the workers to be sober, to work hard and to have few children. It advises the bourgeois to put a reasoned ardor into production. The whole theory of this school rests on interminable distinctions between theory and practice, between principles and results, between ideas and applications, between form and content, between essence and reality, between right and fact, between the good side and the bad side. The philanthropic school is the humanitarian school carried to perfection. It denies the necessity of antagonism. It wants to turn all men into bourgeois. It wants to realize theory insofar as it is distinguished from practice and contains no antagonism. It goes without saying that, in theory, it is easy to make an abstraction of the contradictions that are met with at every moment in actual reality. This theory would therefore become idealized reality. The philanthropists, then, want to reach the categories which express bourgeois relations without the antagonism which constitutes them and is inseparable from them. They think they are seriously fighting bourgeois practice, and they are more bourgeois than the others. Just as the economists are the scientific representatives of the bourgeois class, so the socialists and communists are the theoreticians of the proletarian class. So long as the proletariat is not yet sufficiently developed to constitute itself as a class, and consequently, so long as the struggle itself of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie has not yet assumed a political character, and the productive forces are not yet sufficiently developed in the bosom of the bourgeoisie itself, to enable us to catch a glimpse of the material conditions necessary for the emancipation of the proletariat and for the formation of a new society, these theoreticians are merely utopians who, to meet the wants of the oppressed classes, improvise systems and go in search of a regenerating science. But in the measure that history moves forward, and with it the struggle of the proletariat assumes clearer outlines, they no longer need to seek science in their minds. They have only to take note of what is happening before their eyes and to become its mouthpiece. So long as they look for science and merely make systems, so long as they are at the beginning of the struggle, they see in poverty nothing but poverty, without seeing in it the revolutionary subversive side which will overthrow the old society. From this moment, science, which is a product of the historical movement, has associated itself consciously with it, has ceased to be doctrinaire, and has become revolutionary. Let us return to M. Proudhon. Every economic relation has a good and a bad side. It is the one point on which M. Proudhon does not give himself the lie. He sees the good side expounded by the economists, the bad side he sees denounced by the socialists. He borrows from the economists the necessity of eternal relations. He borrows from the socialists the illusion of seeing in poverty nothing but poverty. He is in agreement with both in wanting to fall back upon the authority of science. Science, for him, reduces itself to the slender proportions of a scientific formula. He is the man in search of formulas. Thus it is that M. Proudhon flatters himself on having given a criticism of both political economy and communism. He is beneath them both. Beneath the economists, since, As a philosopher who has at his elbow a magic formula, he thought he could dispense with going into purely economic details. Beneath the socialists, because he has neither courage enough nor insight enough to rise, be it even speculatively, above the bourgeois horizon. He wants to be the synthesis, he is a composite error. He wants to soar as a man of science above the bourgeois and proletarians. He is merely the petty bourgeois, continually tossed back and forth between capital and labor, political economy, and communism. You have reached the end of The Poverty of Philosophy, Chapter 2, Part 1, The Method, by Karl Marx. Click on the links at the end of this video to go to the playlist, or the next chapter if it's available. If you enjoy this content and would like to support the channel, please like and subscribe.